3 weeks ago, I stood near the back of a packed ballroom in Fairfield, Connecticut, holding a glass of sparkling water while my father took the stage to announce his retirement. He worked his way through the room with his eyes, acknowledging board members and old friends, until his gaze finally settled on the table where I was sitting alone. When he called my name into the microphone, he didn't mention the consulting firm I had built over the last decade, but instead offered a polite, practiced comment about how some children take a little longer to find their footing in life. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. I simply set my glass down on the tablecloth, gathered my coat, and walked out through the side entrance while 200 people tried to figure out why the room had suddenly gone cold. Welcome back to Payback Stories. I'm Laura, and if you enjoy stories about family drama, betrayal, and karma finally catching up, make sure to hit subscribe and drop a comment. Let's get into it. To understand why I walked out of that ballroom without saying a word, you have to go back 12 years to the spring of my sophomore year at college. My family lived in Fairfield, in a broad, 6-bedroom colonial house on 2 acres of manicured lawn, the kind of home that was designed to communicate stability and success before you even stepped through the front door. My father, David Vance, was the chief executive of Vance Logistics, a regional shipping and supply chain company that his father had founded 40 years earlier. We had the country club memberships, the pristine driveway, and the unspoken expectation that everything appearing on the surface had to look perfectly managed at all times. My mother passed away when I was 8 years old after a short, aggressive illness that seemed to take her before any of us had time to process what was happening. I don't remember much about her daily routines, but I remember how gentle she was, how she would sit on the edge of my bed every evening and ask me about my day as if nothing else in the world mattered to her. 2 years after she died, my father married Patricia. She was a poised, ambitious woman who brought her 11-year-old son, Jason, into our home. Jason was 3 years older than me, confident, loud, and accustomed to taking up all the air in whatever room he walked into. Within a year of the wedding, the dynamic in our house shifted in subtle ways that were hard to describe to anyone looking in from the outside. There was no outright hostility or overt mistreatment, but I gradually became a secondary figure in my own home. When Jason made the varsity soccer team or brought home a strong report card, my father would open a bottle of wine and talk about the family legacy over dinner. When I brought home top marks in my advanced mathematics courses, my father would glance at the paper, hand it back with a small nod, and immediately return to whatever report he was reading. Jason was given a new sedan when he turned 16, while I was passed down the older family vehicle with a loose muffler and worn upholstery. I wasn't mistreated in a way that left visible marks, but I learned very early that my presence was mostly treated as an afterthought. The only person who seemed to notice what was happening was my grandmother, Evelyn Vance. She was my father's mother, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman who lived in a modest home about 20 minutes down the coast. Every Sunday afternoon, she would call my personal phone, ask me about my classes, and listen to me talk without interrupting. She used to tell me that quiet people usually saw things much more clearly than the loud ones, and she repeatedly reminded me never to measure my worth by how much attention I received in my father's living room. When she died 2 years ago, she left behind something that completely changed the trajectory of my life. But back when I was 20 years old, I had no idea what she had quietly set in motion. In the middle of my second year at State University, where I was maintaining a high grade point average while studying supply chain management, my father called me home on a random Wednesday afternoon. When I arrived, he was sitting behind his heavy oak desk in his home office, with Patricia standing just behind his left shoulder, her hands resting calmly on the back of his chair. He didn't ask me to sit down, nor did he ask how my midterms had gone. He simply explained that the family was facing some operational tightenings at Vance Logistics, and that because Jason had just been accepted into a prestigious graduate business program in Pennsylvania, some financial adjustments had to be made. He told me, in a very calm, matter-of-fact voice, that they had decided to pause my university tuition payments for the upcoming year so they could fully fund Jason's graduate degree. Patricia gave me a tight, sympathetic smile from behind the desk and said that a young woman didn't really need a formal degree to build a comfortable life, adding that I would likely find a good husband in a few years anyway. I stood there looking at both of them, waiting for my father to say he was joking, but his expression remained entirely blank. When I reminded him that he had promised my mother before she passed away that he would support my education all the way through, his jaw tightened for a second, and he simply said that circumstances change and that we all had to make sacrifices for the long-term good of the family. I learned a few months later, through a cousin, that there had been no financial crisis at Vance Logistics at all, and that the company had actually posted one of its most profitable quarters that year. My father simply preferred to invest in Jason's credentials while treating my education as an optional expense. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, and I didn't plead with him to change his mind. I went upstairs, packed 2 suitcases with everything I owned, loaded them into my car, and drove north to Boston with about $2,000 in my personal savings account. My first apartment in Boston was a 400-square-foot studio above a 24-hour laundromat in Allston. The floorboards rattled whenever the commercial dryers ran below, the radiator clanked loudly all winter, and I lived on cheap soup and discounted bread from the bakery down the street. I managed to land an entry-level job as an administrative assistant at a small, independent freight brokerage firm operated by a gruff, honest man named Arthur Hayes. Arthur was a non-nonsense veteran of the industry who noticed how quickly I processed shipping manifests and how easily I picked up inventory tracking systems. After 3 months, he pulled me into his small office, told me I had a rare head for logistics, and started assigning me complex routing schedules that usually belonged to senior managers. For the next 4 years, I worked 9 hours a day for Arthur, spent my evenings taking free online coursework in supply chain analytics through public university portals, and saved every single dollar I could spare. I cut off regular contact with my family entirely. When my father's assistant sent me a generic birthday card 2 years after I left Connecticut with a small check enclosed, I tore the check into pieces and dropped it into the trash without replying. I didn't want their financial crumbs, and I certainly didn't want their distant, conditional concern. By the time I turned 26, I had accumulated enough capital, industry experience, and operational insight to launch my own independent logistics consulting firm, which I named Meridian Consulting, LLC. I rented a single desk in a shared workspace in downtown Boston, bought a dependable laptop, and hired an experienced corporate attorney to structure the company under a private management trust. I kept my name entirely off the public registration records and primary marketing materials, operating everything under the corporate banner through my legal counsel and my newly hired chief financial officer, Michael Brooks. I kept my identity private for a very practical reason. I knew my father and stepmother, and I knew that if they ever discovered I was building a successful business in the exact same industry my father dominated locally, they would either attempt to insert themselves into my achievements or dismiss my progress as a minor hobby funded by luck. Some people build businesses to demand attention from the people who doubted them, but I built mine in complete silence because I knew that silence was the only boundaries my family would ever respect. 2 years ago, when I was 30, my grandmother Evelyn passed away at the age of 88. I drove down to Connecticut for the funeral service, sitting quietly in the back row of the church while my father stood at the pulpit giving a polished eulogy about how deeply his mother had cared for the family name. I didn't attend the reception afterward, choosing instead to drive straight back to Boston. 3 days later, I received a phone call from an estate attorney named Catherine Wood, who informed me that my grandmother had established a private trust fund 8 years prior, specifically designated for me, with strict legal instructions that no other family member was ever to be informed of its existence. When Catherine read me the letter my grandmother had left behind, my hands were shaking so hard I had to set the receiver on the desk. In the letter, Evelyn wrote that she had watched how my father and Patricia had pushed me aside, that she had tried repeatedly to reason with my father about the tuition money, and that when he refused to listen, she resolved to ensure I would always have financial independence. The trust contained $800,000, gathered from her personal inheritance and private savings. She wrote that the money was mine with 0 conditions attached, and she reminded me to never allow people who failed to see my value dictate how far I could go in life. I took a portion of that trust to expand Meridian Consulting, renting proper office space in Boston's Back Bay district and hiring 4 full-time logistics analysts. The remainder of the money I left intact as an emergency reserve. Over the next 3 years, Meridian grew rapidly, eventually employing 15 full-time staff members and generating over $4 million in annual consulting fees. We specialized in analyzing complex regional delivery networks, reducing fuel waste, and renegotiating carrier agreements for mid-sized shipping operations across the Northeast. This brings me to the detail that would be almost funny if it hadn't been so deeply tied to my family's history. 3 years ago, one of the regional mid-sized carriers that reached out to Meridian for an overhaul of their failing internal logistics framework was Vance Logistics, my father's company. They were suffering from severe inventory delays and rising fuel costs, and their operational margins were rapidly deteriorating. My CFO, Michael, brought the prospective contract to my desk without knowing the personal connection, noting that the client was willing to sign a long-term service agreement if we could fix their distribution metrics. I reviewed the files carefully, authorized Michael to handle all client-facing negotiations through our corporate legal channels, and signed off on the project under our standard corporate trust entity. Over the course of the next 36 months, Meridian's proprietary routing software and restructuring protocols saved Vance Logistics millions of dollars, effectively restoring their profit margins and representing roughly 40% of their total operational savings each year. My father had no idea who was behind the firm. On several occasions, he even praised Meridian Consulting during regional trade association luncheons, telling fellow executives that whichever team was managing Meridian's analytical division was single-handedly keeping regional shipping operations competitive. He was publicly praising his own daughter's work, the same daughter he had declared unfit for an advanced career 12 years earlier. 3 weeks ago, an embossed invitation arrived at my Boston office. My father was retiring at 65, officially handing the chief executive role over to my stepbrother Jason, and holding a grand dinner at the country club in Fairfield to celebrate his legacy. I held the card over my wastebasket for a long moment, intending to drop it inside. But then I thought about my grandmother Evelyn, about 12 years of working 16-hour days in silence, and about the fact that Vance Logistics' contract with Meridian was up for its 5-year renewal at the end of the month. I decided to attend, not because I was seeking an emotional reconciliation that was never going to happen, but because I wanted to look my family in the eyes one final time before I made a purely professional decision about our company's future. The country club ballroom was filled with 200 people when I arrived: local politicians, shipping executives, bankers, and longtime family acquaintances. I wore a tailored black dress, simple silver jewelry, and my grandmother's pearl earrings. Patricia spotted me near the coat check, her eyes sweeping over my appearance with a swift, assessing glance before her face settled into her familiar, tight smile. She made a subtle comment about how surprised she was that I had managed to find appropriate attire on short notice, then casually mentioned that my father had assigned me a seat at table 14, located near the kitchen doors alongside some distant acquaintances. I smiled, thanked her politely, and took my seat without complaint. From my table near the back, I watched Jason move through the crowd in a tailored suit, boasting to a group of regional investors about how he planned to modernize Vance Logistics once he took formal control in January. Later in the evening, I stepped near the main bar to get a glass of water and overheard my father speaking with a silver-haired executive named George, who ran a major ocean freight terminal in New York. George was complimenting my father on Vance Logistics' impressive operational metrics over the past 3 years, asking if he could get an introduction to the executive team at Meridian Consulting. My father shrugged, took a sip of his drink, and remarked that Meridian was an exceptionally secretive firm that operated strictly through legal intermediaries, but added that as long as they continued saving his business millions every quarter, he didn't care who ran the place. While I was standing near the bar, my father's sister, Aunt Karen, and her husband Kenneth walked up to me. Karen looked me up and down with an expression of mild pity, asking if I was still living up in Boston doing small administrative tasks. Before I could answer, Kenneth chimed in, remarking that my father had mentioned I was still trying to find my footing in life, adding that there was no shame in being a late bloomer. I realized right then that my father had spent the last 12 years carefully framing my absence to the extended family, protecting his own reputation by portraying me as a troubled, unfocused child who had simply drifted away due to personal difficulties. At 8 o'clock, the main lights in the ballroom were dimmed, a spotlight hit the stage, and my father walked up to the podium to a heavy round of applause. He spoke for 20 minutes, taking full credit for 40 years of business growth, thanking his business partners, and praising Patricia for her decades of support. He then brought Jason up onto the stage, placing a hand on his shoulder and declaring that the future of Vance Logistics was in the most capable hands possible. Toward the end of his remarks, his eyes scanned the room and landed on my table in the back. He cleared his throat, let out a small, soft laugh into the microphone, and said into the speaker system that he also wanted to acknowledge his daughter, Laura, who had managed to make the trip down from Boston. He followed that with a casual remark about how some children choose traditional paths of success, while others take a long, indirect route to figure things out, adding with a small grin that at least I had shown up for the free dinner. A brief wave of polite, scattered laughter rippled through the room. I sat completely still. I didn't get angry, I didn't feel tears welling up, and I didn't feel the old ache of wanting his approval. All I felt was a sudden, absolute clarity. I picked up my glass of water, stood up smoothly from my seat, and waited for the quiet murmurs around the nearby tables to drop off. When the immediate area grew quiet, I held my glass slightly upward toward the stage, spoke in a clear, measured voice that carried easily across the back half of the room, and said, "Congratulations on your retirement, David. You built exactly the legacy you deserved." I set the glass down on the white tablecloth, picked up my handbag, and walked steadily down the center aisle toward the main exit. The silence that followed my footsteps was immediate and heavy. As I pushed open the heavy wooden doors into the foyer, I heard Patricia's heels clicking rapidly on the marble floor behind me. She caught up to me near the front glass doors, her face flushed with frustration under the bright foyer lights. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing, accusing me of attempting to embarrass my father in front of his entire professional network. A moment later, my father stepped into the foyer as well, his expression cold and stern as he calculated how many guests might be watching through the glass. He stepped close to me and told me in a low, sharp tone to get back inside, sit down at my table, and stop acting like a dramatic child. I looked at him calmly and told him that I was 32 years old, that I was no longer 20, and that I would never stand in a room and allow him to use me as a punchline to cover his own failures as a parent again. When he realized I wasn't backing down, his voice hardened, and he stated that if I walked out those doors tonight, I was completely cut off from the family, with zero financial or personal connection remaining. I looked at him, gave him a small, quiet nod, and said that he had cut me off 12 years ago when he took my mother's memory and my education to pay for Jason's career, and that the only difference tonight was that I was making the separation official. I turned, walked out to my car, and drove back to Boston in the quiet night air. The following morning, I arrived at my office in Back Bay feeling completely calm. I called my CFO, Michael Brooks, into my office along with our head legal counsel. I instructed Michael to prepare a formal notice of contract non-renewal for Vance Logistics, exercising our standard 30-day termination clause at the expiration of their current 5-year agreement. Michael looked over the financial impact sheets on his tablet, reminding me that without Meridian's optimization systems, Vance Logistics' operational expenses would rise by nearly 40% within 60 days, creating severe distribution delays that would likely cause major clients to seek other carriers. I told him I understood the numbers completely, but that Meridian was shifting its corporate focus toward larger national accounts. Alongside the formal corporate notice prepared by our legal team, I wrote a short, professional personal letter to my father. I attached a certified photocopy of Meridian Consulting, LLC's original incorporation papers, showing my name as the sole founder, owner, and managing director of the firm. In the letter, I explained clearly that the operational efficiencies that had kept Vance Logistics profitable over the past 3 years had been engineered entirely by the daughter he had publicly dismissed. I explained that my grandmother Evelyn had funded my initial expansion through a private trust he had never known about, and I concluded by informing him that all business ties between our companies were permanently concluded, requesting that neither he, Patricia, nor Jason contact me again. On Monday morning at 10 o'clock, the certified courier package was delivered to Vance Logistics corporate headquarters in Fairfield. By 11:15, my personal phone began ringing continuously. I had 6 missed calls from my father, 4 from Jason, and 3 text messages from Patricia demanding that I pick up the phone immediately to discuss what she referred to as a massive family misunderstanding. I did not answer any of them. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, my office receptionist knocked on my glass door and informed me that 3 people claiming to be my family were standing in the main lobby, demanding to see the managing partner of Meridian Consulting. I took a slow breath, smoothed down my blazer, and instructed my assistant to show them into our primary conference room. When I stepped into the conference room, my father, Patricia, and Jason were standing near the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the Boston Harbor. My father looked visibly older, his usual composure completely gone, while Jason stood with his arms crossed, his face pale and tight. My father stepped forward, holding the photocopy of my incorporation papers in his hand, his voice cracking slightly as he asked how this was legally possible. I took a seat at the head of the long mahogany table, invited them to sit down, and explained in a quiet, measured tone that Meridian had operated entirely within full legal compliance for 3 years, delivering every service promised under our contract. Jason slammed his hand on the table, shouting that I had set them up, claiming I had deliberately waited until he took over as chief executive to pull the plug on their operations so I could ruin his career. I looked directly at Jason and told him that I hadn't spent 12 years working 16-hour days just to ruin his career, but that I was simply running a business, and Meridian had made a strategic decision to allocate its resources elsewhere. Patricia attempted to adopt a soft, pleading tone, asking why I hadn't come to them years ago so we could work together as a family. I looked at her and reminded her of the day she stood in my father's office 12 years earlier and told me that a girl didn't need an education because she would eventually find a husband to take care of her. My father sat down heavily in one of the leather conference chairs, staring at the table. He offered a brief, tense apology for his comments at the retirement party, asking if we could renegotiate the service contract under new financial terms so Vance Logistics wouldn't lose its core distribution accounts. I looked at him steadily and explained that his apology was only being offered because he was suddenly facing a severe operational crisis, not because he recognized how he had treated me over the last decade. I informed him that the contract non-renewal was final, that our legal team had already finalized the transition documents, and that any further attempts to contact me or my employees would result in immediate legal action regarding corporate harassment. He looked at me for a long moment, the anger in his eyes gradually giving way to a strange, quiet realization that he had completely lost any leverage he thought he possessed over me. He asked quietly if I truly held that much bitterness toward them. I told him that I didn't hold any bitterness at all, because holding bitterness required energy that I preferred to invest in my own life and my own people. I told him that I simply didn't need his approval, his money, or his presence in my life anymore, and that was something he was going to have to accept. They gathered their coats and walked out through our lobby in complete silence, past my analysts who kept their eyes fixed on their screens. A week after that meeting, I received a phone call from my Uncle Thomas, my father's younger brother, who had moved to Vermont years earlier and largely distanced himself from the family. Thomas told me he had heard about the non-renewal notice through extended family channels and felt compelled to tell me something he had kept quiet about for over a decade. He revealed that before my mother passed away, she had established a small, dedicated education fund in her own name to cover my future college expenses. But after her death, my father had consolidated those accounts into Vance Logistics General Reserve during an early expansion phase, effectively using her legacy to fund the company's growth and later cover Jason's graduate tuition. Thomas confessed that my grandmother Evelyn had discovered what my father had done, which was the exact reason she had cut my father out of her personal estate and established the private trust fund for me. Hearing the full truth about my mother's fund didn't break me, but it closed the final open question I had carried in my heart for 12 years. It confirmed that my grandmother had seen everything clearly, and that the independence I had built was rooted in the love of the 2 women who had actually cared for my future. Over the next 6 months, the operational impact of Meridian's exit took its toll on Vance Logistics. Without our real-time optimization systems, their delivery delays mounted, operating expenses rose significantly, and 2 of their largest regional manufacturing clients transferred their freight accounts to competing carriers. Jason was forced to step down from the chief executive role after 6 months, with the board hiring an outside management firm to restructure the business, while my father had to sell a portion of his company equity to cover the operational shortfalls. The story of how Vance Logistics lost its primary consulting partner slowly circulated through the regional business community. And while I never spoke publicly about the situation, the natural consequences of my father's choices handled everything far more effectively than any angry confrontation ever could. As for my life in Boston, it continued to move forward with steady strength. Meridian signed 2 new national manufacturing clients, expanded our team by 6 people, and moved into a larger, permanent office floor overlooking the water. I began seeing a counselor on Beacon Hill once a week to process the quiet grief of letting go of a family that was never truly a family. And I started spending my weekends traveling, reading, and building genuine friendships with people who valued me for who I actually was. Once a month, I drive down to the quiet cemetery in Fairfield, where my grandmother Evelyn and my mother are buried side by side on a gentle, grassy hillside overlooking the trees. I bring fresh flowers, sit on the bench nearby, and tell them about the new accounts Meridian has taken on, about the peaceful life I've built in Boston, and about how much I appreciate the quiet strength they passed down to me. Standing there in the cool afternoon breeze, looking down at the quiet town I used to think controlled my entire world, I don't feel anger, regret, or sadness. I just feel profoundly, permanently free. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Payback Stories for a new family drama story every day, and I'll see you in the next one.